third is a really beautiful musical interval. In this video I'll quickly explain the theory of thirds and then show you how to use them in a musical setting. Okay, first some theory. A third is the third note in a scale. When we talk about thirds, what we're actually referring to is the third note from either the major scale or the minor scale. Okay, so the major scale, if we play it in A, yeah, so the third note of that scale, 1, 2, 3, that's the third, that's the major third. If we look at an A minor scale, slightly different, yeah, 1, 2, 3, that's the third. That's what we're referring to. That's the magic note here that we're going to use in different ways to play thirds. Well, just want to be really clear on that. When we're talking about thirds, we're only ever talking about one of those two notes. The third note from the major scale for whatever chord you might be playing, and the third note from the minor scale for whatever chord you might be playing. That's the note that we're going to play most of the time along with the root note itself. So the root note and the third together, that's generally what guitarists refer to when they talk about playing thirds. They're talking about playing a two-note chord that contains the root note and the third. But of course you could also just target the third note in your lead lines and you would also be playing thirds then too. Remember, if we play a major chord, what we're actually playing is the first, third and fifth notes from the major scale for that chord. That's what major chords are contained of. That's what they're built from. So if we stick with A, the first, third and fifth notes from that scale, they are the notes that are in an A major chord. 1, 3, 5. They're the three notes that make up every major chord. And it's the same for the minor scale. It's the first, the third and the fifth notes from the minor scale. That's how we build a minor chord. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So forgive me for really labouring this point, but I want you to understand this. If you play a C chord, you're actually playing the first, third and fifth notes from the C major scale. If you play a D major chord, yeah, what you're actually playing is the first, third and fifth notes from the D major scale. If you play an E major chord, what you're playing, the notes that are in there, you play 6 strings, but you only actually play 3 different notes, and they are the first, the third and the fifth notes from the E major string. Now the reason why I'm really whacking you over the head with this point is that it's the third note in the scale that dictates whether something is major or minor. This is a really, really important note. You know, maybe the single most important, interval in all of music is the third, because it's what dictates whether something is major or minor. Let me show you an example of that. If I'm playing an A chord here, an A major chord. Okay, so that's an A major chord. If I just drop this finger here, that becomes A minor. It's a chord you probably already know. Now I had to rearrange my fingers there, but actually only one note changed, didn't it? This note here dropped down 1 fret. Now we call that, we say we flattened the third note, which is a bit of a poncy way of saying moved it down a fret. So when you hear somebody say, oh, you flattened the third, what they just mean is they moved it down 1 fret. So whenever you flatten the third, i.e. move down the third note of a chord, you move it from being major to minor. Now you need to know this because when you're playing thirds, you need to know whether the chord is major or minor, because that will influence the shape that you play. Okay, that's enough theory. Now you understand what it is we're actually doing here. Let's play some thirds and see how they sound in a musical setting. There's 2 ways that I usually play thirds, and they're both based on an E-shaped bar chord. So let's look at it here. Again, we'll just stay in the middle of the fret in A. So it's an E-shaped bar chord that I'm playing here, and it's an A chord because I'm on the 5th fret. Okay, now I need the root note, don't I, to be able to play a third. I need the root. So the root note is here, and it's also here. Yeah, they're both A notes, aren't they? Both of these strings are tuned to E. So I can play either fret there. They're both going to be A notes. They're just 2 frets, 2 octaves apart. So that's my A note there. And then I need to add in the third note. So 1, 2, 3. Now that's a bit of an awkward one to play, so we tend not to use that one. We tend to use this one here. Can you hear they're the same note? They're just an octave apart. So if we play here and here, that gives us our third. Or we could choose to play it here and here, and that will also still give us our third, but has a very different tone, yeah? That one's really twinkly, shrill, you know, it'll cut through in the mix really well. Whereas this one, with the bass note, it's warmer, it's rounder. And you can use either one in a different musical setting. So let's see how playing thirds changes things. Right, if I play a chord progression, goes D, B minor, A to G, and I'm just strumming this, yeah, it's just full strumming. Yeah, it's quite big, there's a lot of notes there. Now maybe that's what you want for the song that you're making, but to me, that sounded like a wall of notes. It was too much. It lacked finesse. So if we play that same progression as thirds, then it sounds like this. Yeah, it almost sounds like a different piece of music completely, doesn't it? They're the same chords, but in the first example, I played all of the notes from those chords, you know, with a slightly too gainy sound here on the guitar. And in the second example, I just isolated the root note and the third note. And all of a sudden we ended up with something that sounded much more sophisticated and much more interesting, I think. To me, the tone sounds really pure and beautiful because you've reduced the chord to its distilled essence. That chord can't be expressed more elegantly or simply than this. You know, the shape we use there only has its root note and the note that dictates if the tonality is major or minor. It's gorgeous. The other way that you could play that would be, instead of using this root note and this third, would be to play it like this. Yeah, so in this setting we're using the root note down here and the third here. Now listen to how that sounds. Doesn't really carry itself as well because it lacks some weight, doesn't it? So you can see how the two different types of thirds here can be used in very different ways. The lower version, the higher version that I've just showed you there, the cool thing about that is that works really well as kind of secondary guitar, where you're sprinkling in some extra notes into a piece of music that already exists, and you're kind of adding some stuff on top of it. The lower version, that can kind of carry a chord progression all by itself. When we play this higher version here, one of the cool things is we can slide it around, which works really well. So you can play something like, because it's a movable shape and it's on the thinner strings, you know, that aren't wound, you can really zoom around on them to create some interesting musical moments. So when do I use thirds in my playing? Alright, there's a few ways. Firstly, I'll use thirds in a solo to break up a stream of notes. You know, if you're playing lots of notes, that gets old quite quickly. Thirds can add something interesting and classy, and remember, you need variation in your solos. Thirds are a great way to provide that. You can do some notes, then do some thirds, and then go back to the notes. Okay, the second time that I will commonly use thirds is in a busy mix when you want to add something without playing full chord. Thirds can really complement what's already there. The next way I use it is if I'm using my loop pedal to create something to play over, or if I'm using my loop pedal to add something to something that's already there. The great thing that you'll realize through using thirds is that they work really well as supplementary guitar moments. So, you know, a secondary guitar or filler guitar or whatever you want to call it, it's when you're contributing them into something else. I like to think of thirds as being like garnish that you can sprinkle over a dish. You know, it just adds some seasoning to a piece of music. So basically, anytime that you want to play something tasteful that won't dominate the music, thirds are a great choice. So there's two ways that you can use them, isn't there, to summarize this. One is to add onto something that's already there, and I tend to use, actually I'll use both versions that I've shown you here, this version and also that version, which you can just play with your finger rather than your thumb if you prefer. So both of those versions work well when you're adding to a piece of music, but in my experience, this version works best when you're trying to build a foundation for other things. You know, in that context, thirds can be a really wonderful foundation to map out a chord progression while also still leaving lots of room and space in the mix for whatever else is going to be added later on. I hope you enjoyed this video, picked up some new ideas. If you liked it, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.